Well, thank you all for coming to give me the privilege of extending my welcome, in addition to all the others co-sponsoring organizations, to this fabulous event. And my name is Christopher Yu. I am the founding director for the Center for Technology Innovation Competition at Penn Law. And it's been our privilege to be a partner with Michelle and Holly, with the various organizers who you've heard here over and over again. And really wanted to thank the efforts for particularly of Michelle and Holly for pulling all this together and creating such a vision that has inspired people to produce works that have given us such a vibrant discussion and to address issues that are so critically important today. I can't imagine it being more timely. I can't it being more effective. And it's a privilege for speaking on the audiences here. It's a privilege for us to be here and to be part of it. So thank you for all of that. I could go on with further praise for the wonderful things, but that is not what we're here. It is my privilege to introduce the next panel, and it is going to be moderated by my colleague, Professor Jasmine Harris of the law school, who's one of the nation's leading authorities on law and disability and other aspects. And without further ado, I turn it over to you, Professor Harris.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Christopher, for that lovely welcome. Everyone has their snacks. Everyone has their coffee. This is the best time to do this presentation. I have it easy up here. And so my name is Jasmine Harris, and I'm a professor of law at Penn Law School. Also am so delighted to be here and just want to extend a special thank you to Holly and to Michelle for inviting me to moderate this panel and say hello to my panelists here. And I think we have one person on screen as well. Okay, perfect. And so I want to just ground this discussion. One of the really fun parts of today has been to see some of the themes and expertly woven by the organizers and to see them really come to life. And so I just wanted to ground our particular panel. The name of our panel is the Panel on Healthcare and Research. And Professors Goodwin and Fernandez Lynch, their introduction to the volume for those who've had the benefit of reading it, it grounds us in this overall project. In particular, they discuss what they call the duality of health law. That is the ability to create and exacerbate racial health disparities, as well as law's ameliorative effect, its remedial effect, and potential to advance racial justice through technology and information. This duality concept also runs through their descriptive contribution throughout the volume, though somewhat differently, which is to underscore the hierarchical two-tiered system of social justice that pervades law in other areas and that operates equally in the health law space. I invite you to read the group of papers in this panel related to healthcare and research, as not all the contributors could make it today, but their contributions are fantastic. When read together, these pieces offer a nuanced view of data in conversations about racial justice and health law. The authors in this group of articles, they spotlight the need for data and to contextualize and evidence and mitigate racial disparities in health access and outcomes. But the collective contribution also does something else. It offers a set of cautionary prescriptions that call on researchers to approach data collection carefully, intentionally, and most importantly, holistically. The quality of the data collection and the methods deployed can actually exacerbate or mask upstream inequities, as Kristen, you'll talk about, and also undermine the overall ameliorative effects. So with respect to format, we know it's the end of the day. We want to hear from you most of all and to engage with you. And so I'm going to open it for a few remarks to Kristen and to David, after which I'm going to offer a few thoughts on an ongoing project that I have with respect to data and disability specifically. After that, I will moderate a brief conversation, and then we will open it up, hopefully, for more of your robust questions. So let me take a moment to just introduce our first panelist, Kristin Kostick. Is it Quenet? Quenet. My French is off. Professor Kostick-Quenet is an assistant professor at Baylor's College of Medicine, and she's going to deliver some opening remarks about her co-authored piece, Mitigating Racial Bias in Machine Learning, which examines these broader questions about data in the context of artificial intelligence and machine learning intended to inform healthcare decision-making, specifically about the left ventricular assist devices, or LVAD. Is that how people refer to it? I just thought I was going to refer to it as LVAD. Great. How they use it to identify candidates for it, sharing information about risks and outcomes, and you'll hear from her in just a moment. Our second panelist, there he is David Peloquin. He is a partner at Ropes and Gray, and he's appearing virtually, which I really don't need to say. And he's going to deliver some opening remarks about his co-authored piece, which is also fabulous, entitled Applying Civil Rights Law to Clinical Research, Title VI's Equal Access Mandate. And so to start it off, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kristen, to begin, and you can use the podium or sit where you are, whichever you prefer.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll use the podium. Yeah, hi, I'm Kristin Kostick-Quenet. I'm a medical anthropologist and a bioethicist at Baylor College of Medicine. And our paper, I wrote it with Dr. Jennifer Blumenthal-Barbie, Glenn Cohen, Sarah Gurke, Bernie Lowe, Jerry Eastup, a number of people, and of course our whole development team led by Jim Ontaki at Cornell. And, you know, really the backstory of this whole paper was the fact that, so I've been working with Dr. Blumenthal-Barbie, Jenny, for, I guess, the past 8 years on developing decision support for patients with heart failure, facing advanced heart failure, who are considering different treatments. And the treatment that was our focus was LVAD, left ventricular assist device. And so these are individuals who are facing kind of a no choice decision. You know, they either get an LVAD or they go, you know, they have palliative care. So a lot of them consider it to be kind of no choice. And so we develop these decision support materials, working with patients, interviewing patients, doing in-depth interviews with patients, caregivers, physicians, and also nurse coordinators who are involved, you know, closely with decision making, helping them go through this decision. And so we developed a decision aid, and then we got some more funding to look at factors to help, you know, discover best practices for implementing the decision aid in real context across clinics. And so now what we're doing is we're trying to develop a personalized risk calculator. So basically using machine learning and AI to develop a prognostic tool to see, you know, if we can help patients get a better idea of what's going to happen to them personally. So, you know, in our decision aid, people already have access to what we call generalized statistics. So these are just like the average, you know, the average probability that people are going to live after LVAD, you know, after post-implant for a certain amount of time, the average likelihood that they'll experience, you know, adverse events like bleeding, infection, things like that. So, but, you know, patients look at this and they say, well, okay, well, that's the average. Where do I fit into all of this? And so really we're trying to help develop a calculator to answer that question, to help people figure out how they specifically, given their clinical background, given their demographic, given their age, everything, you know, what they can expect post-implant. And so in order to do that, we had to we had to look at the data that's available, and that's through the Intermax database. It's a national database of LVAD outcomes. And so based on that database, we were very conscious. I mean, being bioethicists, so Jenny and I are bioethicists. we were very conscious of kind of like the ethics of data science. You know, we wanted to take a look at what that data set constitutes. Is there bias in that data set? And you know, following a lot of the guidelines from ethics and AI and machine learning, we wanted to make sure that we had a balanced data set, high quality data set, and whether or not that data set was biased in any way. And of course, one of the first things we looked at was racial bias, because, you know, we are very aware of the fact that Black populations have 30% greater likelihood to have heart failure, you know, just from the get-go. But interestingly, our data set was disproportionately white male. So, and these are people who have already gotten LVAD, right? So this is a data set representing people who have already gotten an LVAD. And so, you know, what we wanted to know is, well, okay, why is this? So of course, you know, even so white males are, I mean, white populations are the majority. So we expected for there to be some disproportion anyway. But we thought that maybe this would be balanced out a little bit by the fact that Blacks are more, you know, they have a disproportionate risk for heart failure. But even still, there was, you know, our database was obviously biased in terms of, you know, the racial disproportion there. So we thought, okay, well, what do we do about it? So as developers, you know, as people trying to develop in good faith an algorithm that's designed for patient benefit, we had to figure out how we were going to address this kind of disparity. And so, you know, this is kind of the premise for the whole paper. The fact that, you know, there's no real legal obligation for developers to undertake to even examine algorithmic bias. There's some best policy guidelines that say, you know, you should report on algorithmic bias, you know, on any kind of sources of bias in your data set through a label or something. Basically, you know, same way pharmaceuticals, you say, well, this is intended for this, you know, this particular algorithm is intended for this population, and this drug is intended for that particular disorder. But even with labeling, that doesn't necessarily keep people from, you know, using it in clinical, you know, real world context where people really just want to know their own personal risk. So, so this got, you know, this is sort of the background for our paper. So whose responsibility is it legally, ethically to address the sources of bias in your data set? And then also, once we started digging into our data, David, I promise I'll give you a chance to speak pretty soon. Almost done. So one of the interesting things that we found is that if we look at racial disparities and outcomes using the data set that we have available, there are no racial disparities in outcomes, right? So Blacks and Latinas and white populations have all the same, you know, there's no real disparity in outcomes based on race that we could find. But what we did discover was that the ability to actually become a candidate for LVAD it leaves out a huge number of Blacks and minorities, and so you're less likely to actually even become a candidate for LVAD if you are a minority. And so that to us was obviously an ethical problematic, you know, and David will talk about this more in his paper too, the fact that there's all these kind of like rational reasons, you know, why you could say, you point to comorbidities, you could say that, well, you know, minority populations have greater rates of obesity or kidney failure, and all these like legitimate reasons why you might deny candidacy to somebody. But then you have to look at further upstream factors. Why exactly are there disparities in baseline health status among these populations that preclude them from candidacy? And also, you know, not just clinical factors, but also social factors. So there's some literature that suggests that Black and minority populations are more likely to be denied candidacy on the basis of social support, a lack of social support, and also a history of drug use and things like that. So, you know, if you look at, you know, like the typical nuclear family composition, I mean, those are the types of stereotypes that are being employed in candidacy decisions. And so, you know, so our job was to sort of like look at what are all these upstream factors But as developers, how do we actually address them? And how do we, we can kind of remedy them, put a Band-Aid on it with statistical means and things like that from a machine learning algorithm point of view. But there's no actual, ability for us to really change the factors that, facilitate candidacy. So anyway, that's the background of our paper.
David, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you fine, and I hope you can hear me as well.
Yes, you're great. We see you. You're great, and we hear you perfectly. That was a great transition from Kristen's project to yours, in terms of Kristen wonders whose responsibility is it to deal with the bias with respect to, oh, I can look over here. Okay, so I don't have to actually go like this with my neck. There you go.
You have to look back at me, yes.
Technology at its finest. Okay, so it's a good transition to your work, because you're thinking about, is there a role for law in terms of addressing these disparities so that the actual data pool and the sample is more reflective of society, and will, again, in terms of the upstream effects, once it funnels down, it'll be more equitable and might actually tell us a little bit more detail and useful information and outcomes, which is what Kristen was getting at. So maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about your project, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
Yeah, thanks so much. And so my project, which I co-authored with my law partner, Mark Barnes, and my former law associate, Joe Liss, and my colleague, Barbara Beerer, we were really focused on the extent to which Title VI could be used as a means to increase equal access to clinical trials. And we really got, I think, interested in this topic, or at least I did as a law practitioner, and then I spend so much of my day, almost every day, counseling different types of clients and what I'll call the clinical trial ecosystem on issues of clinical trial recruitment. There is such a demand for clinical trial subjects, and trying to identify people who are eligible for trials by sponsors of research like pharmaceutical and medical device companies, by universities and medical centers that are conducting research, and increasingly by what I would call ancillary players in the clinical research ecosystem, like clinical laboratories that amass large amounts of data that can be used to identify who might be eligible for a clinical trial. And there's a great push amongst those players, I think, to increase access to clinical trials. Some of it is increasing geographic access. I increasingly work with companies that are using algorithms, for example, to match patients to clinical trials that are trying to reach patients in rural America, for example, who are far from an academic medical center and might not be considered for clinical trial enrollment, and considering whether community practices, for example, physicians might be potential investigators in clinical trials. I also see increasing diversity of clinical trial sites. The idea that like a pharmacy in our community could be a site for a clinical trial, and that individuals could enroll at that pharmacy and have telemedicine visits with the investigator to increase access to clinical trials. In our paper, what we were really focused on is the extent to which entities that conduct federally funded research, and they receive federal dollars, or entities that maybe receive federal money in other parts of their enterprise. Like, for example, they're a hospital and they receive Medicare Part A funding. Noting that all of those types of entities that are receiving federal funding are subject to Title VI with respect to almost all of their programming, including even non-federally funded research. So taking the idea that institutions that conduct a lot of research, that receive some federal funding through things like Medicare Part A or Medicaid, that they would need to apply Title VI when they are conducting research activities, regardless of whether those are federally funded. And we focused on Title VI, which of course bans discrimination based on race, color, and national origin by recipients of government funding. And through regulations issued under Title VI, the government prohibits disparate impact discrimination in addition to intentional or overt discrimination. Now, notably, we talk about in the paper that only the government can bring disparate impact claims under Title VI, given some case law that's developed over the years. And we have seen little attention to date by the government in the use of Title VI applied to research activities. And we think about, well, why might that be the case? Because remember, Title VI says that you can't be excluded from participation in a program or activity that receives federal financial assistance on the basis of race, color, or national origin. And so if we think about a clinical trial, one question that came up in the comments we received on our paper is, well, you can't be saying that everybody's entitled to participate in the trial, right? Because there have to be inclusion and exclusion criteria that would say that you're entitled to participate or not. But rather, our argument is that everybody has an equal opportunity to have the opportunity to participate in the study. And so the Title VI might be used as a means to think about, is there a disparate impact by certain choices that are made in the trial? Such as if we think about a multi-site academic medical center, are there choices about site selection for the trial activities that might have a disparate impact? Or another example we think about is inclusion and exclusion criteria for the study. Obviously, those are scientifically driven, but if there are, for example, racial differences in certain normal lab values, and that's not taken into account when standard inclusion and exclusion criteria are set, there might be a disparate impact on enrollment there. And I think that goes a little bit with the paper we were just talking about before, and the use of the artificial intelligence and how there might be bias there. And we talk a little bit in the paper about what's the enforcement mechanism under Title VI, where the government first has to make a prima facie case that there would be a disparate impact. Then the respondents, in this case, let's say an academic medical center that receives federal funding, has to show a substantial legitimate justification for the policy that they have in place. And then it turns to the government to show that that substantial justification is pretextual and that the less discriminatory alternative exists to achieve the objective. And so if we think about the inclusion exclusion criteria I was talking about, one might be able to show that, well, if you were to balance those inclusion exclusion criteria, like the lab values, let's say, that might differ by the race of the individual tested, if those were balanced by race, then that might be a less this problematic alternative, a less discriminatory alternative to achieve the objective. We also talk about how there is quite a bit of guidance now from NIH and from FDA that's talking about increasing diversity in clinical trials. But the NIH guidance out there continues to leave a lot of discretion in the hands of the investigators, talking about how the scientific interest of the investigator can guide the study, which may in some cases lead to a disparate impact. And we also focus on the fact that there's been limited enforcement today, and we're not arguing necessarily that there needs to be lots of enforcement actions in the space tomorrow, but rather that the regulated community would benefit from guidance from NIH or HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services Office for Civil Rights, that speaks to this issue of how Title VI might be used to ensure equal opportunities for clinical trial enrollment. Because we think a lot of the regulated community, the researchers just aren't aware of this Title VI obligation, even though institutions sign an insurance in which they agree to comply with it, they haven't necessarily contextualized it in the research context. And so having guidance to have some concrete examples of what Title VI requires and how that might be applied in research, I think we argue would be very helpful for the research community. So I'll leave those introductory comments here and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, David. So I want to offer a few of my own comments on a research project I'm working on, and then we can tie everything together since there's so many threads in common between our work. I'm working on a project right now that ties into this broader interrogation of data and in the context of disability and perhaps at the intersection of racial justice. And specifically, there are two core issues that I'm working on. The first order question that I'm thinking about is the availability of data around disability itself. The very availability is something that we're really in the preliminary stages of understanding, since it's often guided by a privacy framework in terms of access to that data. I'm also thinking about how we value data collection in the disability context. Specifically, when I say disability, I mean disability law. I'm speaking from a disability rights framework or disability justice framework, and not with respect to, well, let me say it in a positive way, in an anti-discrimination lens. So how do we get access to the number of people with disabilities, the disaggregated level of data, and is there an intersectional data set? And so that's the second piece of what I'm working on, is how do we think through the core questions? And in the disability context, because it's been guided by this belief that privacy and disability go hand in hand, we don't have a robust public access norm in this area. And so as a result, there are many areas of deficit with respect to unanswered questions. And the only data sets that are available are the general ones. How many kids with disabilities are in public schools? How many individuals who are receiving Medicaid services are part of the home and community-based services waiver program? But the type of rich data needs to be defined as well by the people on the ground. So the conversations that were happening earlier today were really important to the work that I'm doing and what I'm thinking about, precisely because the definition of what questions we want answers to, we have this opportunity to take a step back and engage with community activists. What would you need? What types of questions do you have in terms of the home and community-based services? As you're doing advocacy on the Social Security front, what information would be helpful? From an anti-discrimination standpoint, one of the great powerhouses is the Williams Institute. And the Williams Institute out of UCLA was so critical because it provided that empirical data to support both the legal and policy work that was happening around LGBTQIA+. And disability justice, disability rights community doesn't have the equivalent of that. We have versions in different places, but there's not one center that's generating that type of empirical work. So that's the first bucket of questions that I'm looking at, which is what's the availability of the data itself? How do we value what norms surround data collection? And then the second connects more directly to David and Kristen's papers and those in the same group. And the question concerns the quality of the data and the process by which you gather data, what variables matter, and related to the theme of the event, specifically, I'm interested in thinking through how do we structure an intersectional data set. And what I mean by that is not, let's take the number of people with disabilities, let's use the education context from the DOE, Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights sample, and then let's look at the people with who fall within these various racial and ethnic boxes. But let's look at this together and let's start to understand what a compounded data set might look like, what kinds of variables and what methodologies we might use to actually support that data collection. And I don't think we've had those conversations yet. And it's happened in other spaces, and it's happened in the racial justice spaces. And so I'm really excited about this opportunity to engage with you all about how do we do this in an intersectional way in the disability space. So I'm going to stop there in terms of my own paper, and I want to ask you a question to get us started, Kristen, if I may. So your paper raised some questions about comorbidity, again, going back to the process of data collection itself and how you tease out the variables to increase the accuracy of your decisional model. But how do we think about some of the more ambiguous or amorphous upstream inequities, like the story about Black and Latinx individuals who might not even be eligible to participate and get the LVAD, made me think about people with disabilities and organ transplants. And that concept of being eligible really comes down to what is the valuation of your life. And so in the disability context, we've seen this in COVID, and we've seen it in response to crisis of care standards and some of the lawsuits that have been brought and the activism around it. And so I wondered if there were any lessons in some of that literature that could also help us, to the extent that the answer to your question is we as designers are going to take up the question of remedying some of the bias. Mm-hmm. Are there lessons in there that might inform the work that you do.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah. So how do we remedy that bias? I mean, I think it's beyond the scope of our capability as researchers focusing on this particular project to remedy that bias. But what we can do is, what I think other developers should be doing as well, is to use this opportunity to draw attention and to make a call to the people, doctors. We work with physician champions who are kind of partners on our research, and we publish in cardiology journals and things like that. So I think we really are in a position to make a call on behalf of the people who are trying to help, which are the patients, who are considering LVAD. We can make a call and say, look, these are the real world dilemmas that we've discovered through analyzing, taking a deep dive into our own data set. It's not even our data set. I mean, this is a national database, right? So we can say that these are the questions that we have that were raised by a critical examination of the balance, the quality of the data set, and it raised these particular questions about candidacy for us anyway, in our case, and for other algorithms, for other use cases, it could raise other questions about access and inequities that I think that can be highlighted just through the examination of through the development of an algorithm, which requires critical examination of a data set in terms of data quality and balance. And just those basic questions can highlight a lot of systemic inequities and systemic factors that need to be addressed. In our case, it's the candidacy question. So we can make a call to the doctors, the physicians who are the gatekeepers for LVAD, so we can basically say, like, okay, well, there's a certain literature that shows that social support is an issue, comorbidities are an issue. There are other factors that are issues as well, but how systematic are those as exclusionary criteria? How much interpretation is involved in candidacy decisions, and how much implicit bias potentially is involved in those candidate decisions as well? And so those are types of things that we as researchers, just focusing on an algorithm, can say, these are questions that we feel should be addressed, and make a call on the research community and the clinical community to address them.
So that's interesting, because the notion of discretion is really big here, right, with respect to who is going to be chosen as a candidate. And I wondered, in terms of thinking about David's prescriptive work, you could imagine a role for ethics and bioethics in this, because bioethics has principles. When you think about equity being a guiding principle, the question I would have is, what are the legs, right? What are the sort of remedial legs there with respect to enforcement? But turning to David, when we think about the role of the law, because Kristen in some sense encourages us to think about promoting standards, increasing guidance, and your work is saying, yes, we could have greater guidance here. And I think one of the connections between both of what you're saying and my own work here is, in the disability context, what's so problematic is that there's enormous discretion. But when you have enormous discretion in the face of problematic social norms, and the people who are interpreting and exercising that discretion do not fundamentally understand disability or racial bias or racial justice, you don't actually move the needle any. So I wondered for you, David, what do you envision when you're thinking about the remedy? So on the administrative side, greater guidance, more lawsuits being filed, so a more robust enforcement unit. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that likely what we're going to see in this space is more guidance that's given by the funders of research. Because remember, the NIH is a huge funder of research, and it's NIH funding that can, for institutions that accept it, lead to the application of Title VI. And so I think that's one place where we would see more activity. And I think that's probably more likely than that we're going to have lawsuits against institutions for Title VI violations in the research context, especially given the way that research typically plays out, and it's something that we want to further rather than stymie. I think that would be helpful if we had more coordination perhaps amongst the different parts of HHS that either fund or regulate research, because I think we have had guidance from FDA in this space and from NIH. We also have, of course, the Office for Human Research Protections, which regulates all of the federally funded research, or most of the federally funded research that takes place in this country. And that would be another source where I think one could have guidance on this point. I think another area that's worth thinking about is, remember, we talk about in the paper that even if an institution only accepts federal funding, let's say for treatment purposes, it's accepting Medicare dollars for the treatment of patients, and it's conducting privately funded industry-sponsored clinical trials. Those industry sponsors of research could also be attentive to these requirements and note the application of Title VI to that institution, to their clinical trial site. And so I think that's another place where, even if it's industry-funded research, the institution may still be subject to Title VI. And one of the other things I think we note in the paper is that increasingly research is being carried out in institutions that do not accept federal funding. So we see the growth of contract research organizations that are opening their own clinical trial sites that are not traditional healthcare providers, but are sites that spring up and conduct only industry-funded research, for example. And there, because there's not even any Medicare or Medicaid dollars for treatment purposes, let alone federal funds for research, those types of institutions, the CROs, would fall outside of the Title VI framework entirely likely. And so I think in those types of research settings, which are increasingly common, we would need the industry sponsors and the funders of those research to really make a push, I think, for ensuring that there is equal opportunity to enroll in those studies as well, despite the lack of the Title VI mandate.
Just a follow up to that, when I think of Title VI, I also think of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, or Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And you mentioned in your paper, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, these kind of classic civil rights laws to kind of push exactly what you're looking to do, just increase the attention to not only the outcomes, but equal opportunity to participate, right? Is that the way I think you described it? How do you see those other laws coming into play? And do you think that they have an equally useful trajectory in terms of remedial path here?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And I think definitely some of those other laws may be relevant, I think, as we continue to think about equal access to clinical trials and ensuring there's an equal opportunity for enrollment. I think we focus on Title VI largely because there is such a focus now on diversity, equity, and inclusion in trials. But I think definitely when we think about diversity more broadly and we think about barriers to entry, I do think that there is analysis to be done with respect to how those other laws may apply in the clinical trial recruitment context, especially given the increased focus on recruiting ever harder to reach populations by sponsors of research and those conducting research.
How are we doing on time?
Okay, but there may be questions from the audience. I know that I have a comment.
If not, yes, if not, we can go back to talking. But at this point, Kristen, if it's okay with you, and David, if it's okay with you, open it up to have a broader conversation, comments and questions.
So I'll do the chair's prerogative and then pass it back. So, Kristen, when your talk began, there are 2 points that come to mind for me, because I think language really matters, and at a conference like this. So, for example, when you mentioned Black patients from the get-go have disparities with regard to matters of the heart, let us say, I think that that's a dangerous kind of framing, because nothing is from the get-go. Early on with the talk with regard to FIDO, there were suggestions that FIDO would have a special effect on Black people. And it's just ridiculous, right? A Black person who lives in Lincoln Park in Chicago, who's well-to-do, has a very different kind of environment, stressors, etc., than someone living on the south side of Chicago. It's very different. You can't conflate by race. And the same is true when we think about what is rational and legitimate. I think that a different way of thinking about that happens to be what appears to be race neutral on its face rather than rational and legitimate, because there's nothing rational and legitimate about laws or policies that we know have disparate racial impacts, right? And so they may be neutral on their face. And I think that that's a way to frame, and that's one of the ways in which we actually seek to frame some things in law. And I mention that just because it is important, especially in a milieu such as this. David, one of the recommendations that I wanted to make, and you may actually already engage with this, is that Makai Yearby for a long time has been working in the Title VI area. And the area in which he's been working in Title VI happens to be also with regard to access, but looking at elder care and access within the spaces of nursing home support. So that's it for me. And I know that we've got commentary in the back.
Thank you. My question relates to comorbidities as exclusion criteria for both the the heart procedures and other things that influence. And I don't think there's been enough attention given to this, because the inclusion and exclusion criteria for clinical trials usually favor the investigators, and they want a clean comparison. So if you have 2 or more diagnoses, then you may not be able to get into it. It's a particular problem in the cancer clinical trials, I think. And I'm wondering if the data scientists could help with how one could include those patients. I mean, you mentioned balancing them across randomization, but how patients who do have comorbidities, which is a fair proportion of, say, Black people over 45, everybody's got hypertension, and then there's something else going along with that. Is there a way to help use data to help incorporate that risk into the clinical trial analysis or something of that sort?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that is what one would need to do in analyzing the inclusion exclusion criteria and thinking about, remember that the test we laid out when we were talking about under Title VI, one has to show that a less discriminatory alternative exists to achieve the same objective, but rather that's what the government has to show when it's bringing in action under Title VI under the burden shifting framework. And I think data science, and I'm not a data scientist myself, of course, but I think that is one thing one might use to show there is a less discriminatory alternative, perhaps, that would achieve the same objective. So I think there is work to do there, and that's an excellent point.
Yeah, if I could just say something about that too. I think that most physicians would love to look at comorbidities as potential mediating factors of outcomes. I think that the constraining factor is really the time. There's a pressure on there's only an amount of time to collect the data, and then there's pressure to publish data to get results and everything. So I think there are systemic, sorts of pressures as well, like to try to get the most amounts of data within a short period of time and to make the most robust inferences from those data. But that's not to say that I don't think that researchers are, at least those operating in good faith, are interested in the effects of comorbidities. And so I think it has to be a balancing act about, what's realistic, but then also what's representative of the sample that the patient sample that you're trying to actually help. If they all have comorbidities, then you better include it in your, in your trial. But so, not just have like a super clean trial with a super clean outcome, So, yeah, I think it all comes down to context as well, like who you're actually aiming, who's your target population, who you're trying to help, and what are the representative characteristics of those populations.
So oh, sorry, go ahead, Jasmine.
Sure, I'm just going to be brief, but if I could just jump in, I mean, I think part of the issue is there's no incentive for people, for data scientists right now to do that, to take into consideration the comorbidities. And so part of the question becomes, what are the carrots and sticks that we're going to put in place to be heavy-handed and make sure that this structural concern is taken into account every single time, including forcing people to actually write, as judges do, findings of fact and conclusions of law. So it's an onerous, sure, it's an onerous requirement, but I think the problem warrants something that is structural and something that, you know, may take some time and have cost to it.
So actually I have two questions, one of my own, and then one from the audience here. So let me ask mine first, which is to you, David. You know, when I first read your paper, I thought, isn't this a clever approach, right? We have all of these people talking about the lack of diversity in clinical trials and the implications of that. How can we address it? Using, you know, Title VI as a tool here could be potentially really, really helpful. And so I wondered two things. One, what do you think the priority for government enforcement ought to be, recognizing that there are, you know, limited resources that the government has available to enforce Title VI claims? Should they, you know, spend more time and attention focusing on this area? And then related to that is a role for people like you in private practice who are advising clients, right? That they may have this Title VI obligation, but the government isn't really enforcing it, right? So it's something that that people could be made aware of, that they might not be made aware of, but at present, the legal risks are fairly low. And so I wondered if you could maybe talk about both of those points. And when you're finished, I have a question from someone else in the audience.
Okay. So I think, I mean, that's a great point, Holly, that as a practitioner advising clients, they are always focused on what is the risk and are there any enforcement actions in this space? So even if one says this is what the law requires, like there's that question about like, has this been enforced? And of course, I don't advocate for my clients to be enforced against by the government, but I do think that, and that's why I think one of the first steps that the government would take here is really be more clear on the guidance from NIH and the funders of research and from FDA as well. Perhaps reminding researchers about the existence of this obligation, because I think they haven't clearly focused on it in those forums. And so the regulated community itself hasn't focused on it as well. And I think that the idea of like enforcement actions being taken would come after, you know, there were clearer guidance to point to, and the regulated community, I should say, were more on notice at that point. And then I think at that point we might see the enforcement actions take place. But I do think, Holly, that you're right, that is often in the absence of enforcement, that people aren't, you know, as focused on these obligations when they're assessing their overall compliance program.
Great. I think Steve has a question, and then if there's time, come back to me and I'll ask the audience question.
You go ahead with the audience question, Holly.
Okay, great. So there's a question from Molly McNulty, also for you, David, about an NIH-funded study of that she says has Title VI implications. And there was a topic of discussion that race is not a legitimate biological category. And so scientific research into sickle cell disease was not legitimately targeted for study recruitment. And she asks your opinion about how to address those types of inclusion criteria and study specific criteria.
And I didn't fully understand the question about race. Was race being used as an inclusion or exclusion criteria from the study? I understand that sickle cell disease, of course, it was used as an inclusion criteria. Okay, thank you for clarifying that, Molly. Yeah, and I think there one would have to think about from a scientific perspective, like, is this able to be justified? And is there a less discriminatory alternative that would achieve the same objective? And perhaps there's not in this case. And so that this is an appropriate inclusion criteria. And I think we're not saying that you can never take into account legitimate, you know, scientific criteria. It's just that one has to be attentive to what is the, you know, from a Title VI perspective, what's the impact of the choices that are made here.
Sorry, David, sorry to pick on you. Steve Jaffe from Medical Ethics and Health Policy.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, nice to see you again. My question, you talked about the difficulty of extending this Title VI argument to pharmaceutical companies,
Yeah.
organizations, et cetera. And it's sort of a technical legal question. Obviously, those entities, at least the pharmaceutical companies, sell their products to Medicare
Mhm.
VA
Yeah.
programs. Is that enough hook, or does Title VI not work that way?
The fact that they produce a product that is eligible for Medicare reimbursement, that I think in and of itself wouldn't be a hook because they're actually receiving that Medicare reimbursement. And that's the same thing that we run across with like the contract research organization sites that aren't billing any federal healthcare programs for the services that they offer. I guess one other thought I would add to that, and I actually haven't looked into this, but I'm going to say it thinking aloud here, is that during the pandemic, like the federal government is funding companies and activities in a way it didn't before the pandemic. And I think there is something to be thought about our additional institutions or additional companies accepting federal funding and thus perhaps subject to Title VI. Now, some of that federal funding during the pandemic has come through alternative funding vehicles that do not necessarily carry with them all of the requirements that like federal grants and contracts do. So I do think there might be an interesting analysis to do there about the expansion of federal funding and new federal funding vehicles during the pandemic, and how that might affect the applicability of Title VI. That's a great question, Steve, that you posed.
And we have one last question.
That's a mic. My question, and I think a lot of you are touching on it, is around how you figure out what components of the unseen you aren't measuring that are absolutely critical to understanding problems. And I guess I just wonder if you have thoughts about it. I know I live in North Carolina and we see data sets that list Hispanic as race, which becomes really problematic for untangling what is actually happening and who it is happening to. And so I would just love your thoughts generally around that problem of the unseen and who gets to make decisions around what data matters. And then Dave, for you, I also just wonder this Title VI argument, how far down a recruitment rabbit hole do we go if we start to really evaluate the implications and problems of race in clinical recruitment? And what we require of folks to meet, a non-discriminatory standard in clinical research with a long, pretty difficult history that we need to wrestle with. Thanks.
David, do you want to start?
Oh, sorry, I missed it. Yeah, I think the second one was really addressed to me, I think. And so I think that the question about how far down the rabbit hole, are we going in clinical trial? It's obviously a tough balance and one that requires scientific minds as well, because we don't want to upset the scientific integrity of the studies by causing, I think, the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the trials, for example, to change in a way that harms the science. But I think, as we note in the paper, there's other things that one can be looking at as well from a Title VI perspective, like site selection, like where are these clinical trials cited, particularly because so many clinical trials are multi-site today. And we have health systems that have multiple locations, and they're able to choose like at which of those locations are they making the trial available. Is it only available at the premier center in one location, or is it going to be made available at community clinics in more outlying areas, for example, that might lead to more equal opportunity for enrollment? So I think the commenter has a good point there, but we also might want to think more broadly about under Title VI, in addition to inclusion exclusion criteria for the study, what other things might we look at when assessing equal opportunity?
Okay, I probably have a minute, right? That's about right. Okay. So we can talk later, but let me just give you my 1 minute spiel, which is, I think in the context of race and disability, which is where my interests lie, when we're talking about how upstream do we go, part of that is really going to involve asking people on the ground, what are your priorities? And so the agenda is really not set yet. So I think collecting the variables, and then the second order question would be, what are the best methodologies to apply here? An interdisciplinary lens, such as, anthropology, sociology, plus medicine, and bioethics would be one example of kind of bringing together all this expertise. But it's really, my hope is to push in a direction of just starting from the ground and then doing the research in a participatory way.
Well, just, if I can add to the invisible, the things that are sort of invisible. You know, for us, we're in designing a decision aid, we are trying to convey to patients what they, you know, what life might be like if they get an LVAD and what life might be like if they don't. But we're only dealing with a database that entails people who did get an LVAD. And so all of the outcomes of people who could have potentially gotten an LVAD, but didn't, you know, we don't have those data because they're not tracked, not documented. So we just don't know. So that to us is an invisible set of outcomes data, and we just don't have access to it. But for us, it's critical for supporting quality informed decisions, you know, values-based decisions, things like that. So we just can't even get that information. And so one of the calls is to ask doctors and hospitals and the whole, you know, healthcare system to document outcomes as well, and to document why exactly people aren't becoming candidates. I think that that's important too. And even though people have it in their like, there's usually a social worker who comes and documents, you know, okay, well, this person doesn't have social support, and so that's one of the reasons factoring into their, you know, why we declined them for candidacy. Those things are documented really informally, literally like in handwriting, you know, and we went through a lot of those handwriting, you know, all those written notes in one study. But across clinics, across hospitals, those data are not documented systematically that would, in a way that would allow us to make, you know, inferences across the board. So I think it's really important to document and to make those data sets actually, to have them exist, you know, so that we can figure out what to do, you know, what kinds of best decisions to make. So.
Join me in thanking our panel for such an important discussion. Thank you so much, Jasmine.